In an unpredictable world, you can't simply wait for change to happen. We created McKinsey Live for leaders like you. Our global experts break down the need to know on the issues that matter most to decision makers and to society. We'll introduce you to leading research, new and transformational ideas, and practical knowledge and strategies, all to empower the changemakers of today, enabling you to step forward boldly, tackle real challenges, and drive change with clarity and purpose. We're helping you take control so you can drive the conversation, so you can lead fearlessly while leaving no one behind, so you can take the reins to create and accelerate growth, so you can build resilience for the future. Together, we can push towards the opportunities of our era. Let's get started now.
Welcome to McKinsey Live. Today's moderator is Lucia Rahili.
Hello and welcome to McKinsey Live. I'm Lucia Rahili, McKinsey's editorial director and your host for today's event. Again, the goal of this series is to give all of you the opportunity to engage on our latest research, so please use the Q&A functionality to ask anything that comes to mind over the course of this event. Today, research on the state of Black residents, place, racial equity, and transformative solutions. Joining us to talk through some of the essentials of this research are Shelley Stewart III and J.P. Julian. Shelley is the chair and J.P. is a leader of McKinsey's Institute for Black Economic Mobility. It's our research institute and think tank for advancing racial equity and inclusive growth in the U.S. as well as around the globe. Shelley is also a senior partner, and he's a leader in McKinsey's growth, marketing, and sales practice. He leads our reputation and engagement function, overseeing marketing, communications, and publishing. And he's also active in a number of organizations in New York where he's based, including the Economic Club of New York and the board of directors of the Brooklyn Community Foundation. He's a busy guy. JP is a partner and leader within McKinsey's philanthropy practice, where he leads work on economic and racial equity, as well as our public sector practice, where he works with quite a range of U.S. cities and states on inclusive economic development. He's also got deep expertise in economic mobility, racial equity, and housing. JP is based in Philly. He's based in Philadelphia. Shelley and JP, welcome to McKinsey Live.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So a few years ago, in 2021, we published some research examining both the barriers and opportunities confronting Black Americans in the U.S. economy broadly. Shelley, you then turned your focus to a specific facet of that research, namely what we're calling the Black resident experience, or the relationship between where Black populations live and the quality of their lives. It seems clear that there's a dramatic difference in a range of outcomes for Black Americans compared with their white neighbors. So tell us, why did you choose to focus on place, and what's really at stake here?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Lucia. So as you mentioned, in recent years, there's been a really acute focus on disparities across America, particularly racial disparities. And oftentimes we talk about these things at a national level. And we talk about the gaps, whether it be the wealth gap or housing rates. And that is important, but in fact, to really understand the nature of the issue, but also to get to the solution set, you've got to really think about it at a much more granular community level. People shape places, and places in turn shape outcomes for people. Right where you live impacts all sorts of stuff about your life. From an early age, it affects what schools you go to. It affects the access you have to basic necessities like healthcare or even broadband infrastructure. And so our research really sought to understand this geographic variation in economic, social, and physical well-being, both in general, so absolute terms, but also on a relative basis. And what we're really trying to get at is, if we are going to thrive economically at a county level, a state level, a national level, we've really got to have an economy that is working for all, in service of more inclusion and more and a more dynamic economy. And so we really sought to understand at a granular level, what are the solutions that we can bring to the fore to help make this a reality. So as we thought about baselining this research, we wanted to come up with some frame to think about what it means to thrive. And so we pulled down a set of metrics that we thought were universal, in a sense, that would describe well-being for all folks, things that we all think are important, and also things we could measure. And so we looked at things like a basic standard of living, measures around financial stability, the job opportunities that exist in a specific place, physical and virtual connectivity, so infrastructure. We looked at housing. We aggregated those things and said, let's create an index that will be indicative of whether someone is living, has positive and good and strong well-being. And we looked at that in absolute terms. So we said, how well do Black outcomes in these places, compare overall? So, like, are people thriving? Are they having a good experience? And we looked at that change over the last decade to see what is the rate, what is the direction of travel. But then we also looked at it on a relative basis and said, how do Black outcomes in a given place compare to outcomes for other residents in the same place, to get a sense for what is possible in a place if everyone is thriving and participating. And that was the basis for this research.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Shelley. So JP, let's bring you in here. Shelley's outlined the frame. Talk to us about what you found when you conducted this analysis.
Yeah, we found a couple interesting things. The first is that realities are really different by place. So we took the over 3,000 counties in the US, and based on the size, diversity, growth of their economies, their population demographics, came up with essentially 13 distinct community profiles. And what you find is that places like megacities like New York, where Shelley is, or independent economies like Little Rock, Arkansas, or the urban periphery like Arlington, Virginia, look fundamentally different when you look at Black outcomes. And that is both when you compare outcomes for Black residents across those places, but then looking at those resident outcomes relative to their neighbors. The second thing, and I think on a bit of a bright spot, is that there has been progress. And so we find that in over 70% of the counties that we looked at over the past decade, on an absolute level, Black resident outcomes have improved. So this is material things like improvements in the rates of poverty, improvements in digital connectivity, things like levels of education have all seen real gains. I think what has been challenging, and the third thing I'll highlight, is that progress hasn't been nearly fast enough. And so we've seen significant backsliding on some areas like life expectancy and rates of home ownership. And taken together, what that looks like is, if we continue on this rate of progress that we've seen over the past decade, we will not close Black-white equity gaps for 320 years in some of these communities. And so still a lot of work to do in terms of the progress that's out there. What we expected and what we know to be true based on our prior research is that Black Americans aren't equally distributed across the US. There are some material concentration of our Black population. And so what we found is that, in particular in mega cities and stable cities, is where we see over half of the Black population in the US today. So places like Philly, where I am, and Columbus, Ohio, are where we see an overrepresentation of the Black population. And that has meaningful implications in terms of the outcomes that we see. And as Shelley will get to, the solutions that are possible, particularly for Black residents, given those concentration effects.
Okay, so JP, I live in New York City in Brooklyn, so I found it actually really interesting and also somewhat dismaying that is in fact America's suburbs and not our cities that have the best balance of overall positive outcomes and parity for Black residents. Is that right? Tell us what factors allow for this this positive net gain for Black populations in suburban communities over these megacities that you just alluded to.
So that's right. The urban periphery. So think about this as the exurbs and suburbs, typically around major cities, are the places where we see kind of the most positive Black outcomes. And that's both in an absolute sense, but also when compared to their neighbors. And I think that is a kind of twofold reason. One is a bit of proximity. So many of these places are right directly near thriving economic engines. So places with growing and diverse economies that offer great job prospects. And at the same time, like you in New York, Lucia, have access to great social capital institutions that are so critical for economic mobility. And at the same time, they're in this Goldilocks zone where they offer access to more affordable housing, higher quality education in many situations. And so in some cases, they are in this kind of sweet spot for Black residents that may help with some of those outcomes. That said, I did want to highlight, even though these are the places where Black residents are doing best, two things I'll note. One is, even in these places, Black residents are doing 64% as well as their white neighbors. So in the best performing community profile on average, Black residents are doing a little bit less than 2/3 as well as their white neighbors. So still a lot of room for improvement there. And then secondly, these are not places that are many Black residents live. So about 12% of Black residents live in the urban periphery relative to about 90% of white Americans. So yes, a positive story in some ways, but as you can imagine, still a lot of room for progress as we look ahead.
Thanks, JP. Okay, Shelley, let's pull back a little bit. What would you say is the main headline of this body of research?
Yeah, thank you, Lucia. Look, I think the thing that was maybe most surprising for us was what's here on the page, the fact that virtually nowhere in the US are outcomes for Black residents equal to those of their white neighbors. And so we knew that disparity existed, and we knew that it would be widespread. I think we were expecting that there could be a few more bright spots, but actually what we found is less than 0.1% of Black residents live in a county where their overall well-being score is at least 90% of their white neighbors. And as JP mentioned, if you play the movie forward, even taking into account the progress that's been made, you're looking at somewhere between 100 and 300 years to actually eliminate or close these parity gaps. And I think there's no secret that, or it's no secret that, generations of explicit discrimination against Black Americans have played a role in creating the starting point here. And we can't reverse that. But we do believe, based on what we've seen in some of these bright spots and some of these places that have had more progress, that we can improve the quality of life and address these inequalities. And we think that we truly believe that will be a boon to local economies as well as our national economy. And so, look, I think there's a clear sense of urgency that we had coming out of doing this research, and there are tools that can start to address these challenges. And we recognize that this is a problem that will require us to pull lots of different levers in these communities. We focused, for the purpose of this research, on two particular areas where we think real progress can be made in the over the next, call it 5, 10, 15 years. One is affordable housing, and the other is early education access. And we start there because of the data. Black Americans are more likely to be financially burdened by housing costs and less likely to have access to quality early education. And so if we jump then into the specifics of this, this is a topic that has been, I think, fairly mainstream and discussed for quite some time. We have an affordability issue with housing. We know that stable housing in mixed income neighborhoods can dramatically improve outcomes for children, particularly underserved children. There's an increasing body of research that suggests that there's a really important word in there, which is this idea of mixed income. And so we have housing that is affordable in areas that has a mix of socioeconomic levels is a really critical factor in boosting outcomes for folks who are born with less resources. The scale of the challenge is big. We're talking millions and millions of units needed, and we recognize that there is also significant cost that go along with that. I think the good news is this is one of the places where we truly believe the private, the public, and the social sector can come together in harmony to really make a huge difference in a way that is economically viable. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that needs to potentially be changed with respect to permitting and lot size and things that are really within government's remit. It'll look different in urban areas than it will in rural areas, but we do believe that there are ample case studies out there of what can be done to try to move the needle on this particular issue. Moving then to discuss education. Again, similar to housing, there is an increasing body of work that looks at the ROI from investing early in our children. And there are the direct educational benefits, but we also know that high quality programs early have real implications for childhood poverty and how people experience that. They increase the parent and especially the mother's ability to work. And this relates to this broader discussion around childcare. And just it accrues lots of benefits to all the folks who are in these schools by exposing them to a broad set of individuals. The scale of this problem is large as well. If you just look at kind of the early education, there's probably around 6 million places needed. That comes with a cost. Again, there's ample research on what the ROI on that investment is. These solutions may look different depending on whether you're in an urban or a rural area, but this is an investment that we can make in our next generation that will have disproportionate benefits for those who are underserved today, and will have therefore disproportionate benefits to our economy over time. And so this is another area where we've been quite focused on trying to advance the discussions around what we can do differently.
Right. It's interesting. We've seen attention to early childhood education, of course, in New York City as well. My daughter benefited from universal pre-K, which was fantastic. So let's now turn to questions from our audience. We've got a little bit of time, and this is one of the more engaging parts for our audience. A number of questions here from folks who want to make a difference and don't know how because of the acuity of what you're describing and the need for, as you described it, to pull a lot of different levers for an integrated, holistic solution. Are there any tangible steps you would recommend to begin to close this gap that you, Shelley, and JP have described? And either of you can take that.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then JP, I'll turn it over to you. I mean, again, it is hard to get overly tactical given the scale of the problem that we face, but I just a few thoughts. I think one is just by virtue of starting to engage, but being in forums like this, following the research coming out of lots of great institutions on this huge opportunity that we have to solve together is the first step. I think the way you action it is a function of a couple of things. One, what sector or industry do you work in? So certainly if you work in education or you work in healthcare or you work in housing, ensuring that you have a foundational understanding of the role your sector plays in helping to address these challenges and then advocating for that change within your institution. Right, whether it be if you're a healthcare provider, how are you thinking about health equity and access? If you work in the food industry, the restaurant industry, how are you thinking about access and the things that you bring to certain neighborhoods and communities? So in your individual sector, I have not found a sector yet, Lucia, where there's not something you could be doing to move your institution that would help to drive change for this particular issue. The third thing I would say is, as with all things, civic engagement matters on these things. And so understanding what policies might be conducive and supportive of the sort of change you seek, whether it be in affordable housing or with respect to education, and ensuring that you're advocating and trying to advance those particular ideas is a good way for us to be involved, even where our direct remit or control is not as direct on that issue. I don't know, JP, what you'd add.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, Shelley, is I think sometimes this problem can feel really big. And so oftentimes it's really helpful to think local, right? So in your neighborhood, in your city, there are probably great organizations already doing great work. How do you think about plugging in there, whether it's through where you work or in your personal volunteer time? I think in some ways, a lot of the solutions that we talk about happen and need to happen locally and be informed by resident perspectives. And everyone listening to this call lives in a place, and that place has a set of challenges. Thinking about taking local action, I think, is also a really helpful way to get started on this topic.
Okay. We've got a question here on what we're seeing at the local level for folks who are not Black. In other words, Shelley mentioned life expectancy. He mentioned home ownership. Did we look at any of these dynamics for other demographics? And if so, what did we find? And JP, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, happy to. So as a follow-on to this original research, we actually ran similar analyses for Latino residents in America. And what we find is that there are some real differences, right? So there's a higher percentage of Latino residents in megacities, for example, even higher than Black residents. We also find that Latino residents have seen even more absolute progress, which is encouraging. So in 86% of counties across the US, we've seen absolute outcomes for Latino residents improve. But I think the thing that was, concerning, but also, really a call to action is, even despite some of the progress we're seeing in the Latino community, for example, closing equity gaps between Latino and white residents is still 70 to 120 years away if we keep at this rate of progress. And so I would like to live in a world where my grandkids are, not the first ones to see, real parity, but something that we can really do here and now. The other thing I'll highlight is Raj Chetty's most recent research that came out this summer also highlighted that low-income white Americans are also experiencing, declines in economic mobility and widening gaps between the lowest and highest income adults. And so another kind of call to action, that economic mobility is a topic that really does affect every place and every demographic group. And so I think there's a lot of work to do still to support and accelerate that work, both in the Black community and in other non-Black communities as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Super helpful. Okay, let's try to squeeze in at least one more, possibly two. Shelley, you talked about the need for a multi-stakeholder solution, right? A private, public, social sector coming together. Could you talk a little bit about partnerships in particular? In other words, what kind of partnerships might leaders consider to accelerate the pace of achieving greater equity?
Yeah, and I want to just lift up one point that JP said. One of the things that we're doing right now is, as the Institute is, we are doing some work on rural economic mobility, leveraging some of the foundational work we've done here. And again, it cuts across places, it cuts across races, and we see a real challenge in rural communities where the economic context has deteriorated. And so we're excited to be a voice and to start to help us think through and advance solutions that are very specific to that archetype, because those challenges are quite unique. When I start to think about partnerships, there are lots of different, and again, it depends on the sector that you're playing in. One of the places where I've seen some interesting things happening is this idea of integrated place-based transformation. These are like the ultimate partnerships, where when you go into a place that is struggling with economic mobility, you need to set a pretty big table. And what we're increasingly seeing in places are these big, bold initiatives where you've got the government coming in. Example, if it's a city, you've got the mayor's office coming in, and they've got an arm that's focused on economic mobility. You've got the private sector CEOs that have either their headquarters or major facilities, the big employers in that place, they're sitting at the table. You've got the big foundations who are investing in economic mobility and who are managing portfolios of initiatives around, whether it be around education, mental health, healthcare, health equity. And you're setting these broad integrated tables to come up with an integrated transformation journey. I mean, really borrowing from some of the things that we've seen with our private sector clients and saying, we're going to run a 3 to 5 year play that has granular initiatives, that has a mix of funding from the public, private, and social sector, everyone marching against an integrated plan and really holding each other accountable for outcomes. And that's what it's going to take. If we're going to truly transform places, we need these multi-stakeholder coalitions to come together and to run an integrated play, because one of the failure modes has been, with lots of good intention, one-off siloed initiatives that are not integrated and that don't benefit from the synergies and integration. If we can start to really roll this model out in more places, I truly think we can shorten the duration that we identified with respect to closing parity and improving absolute outcomes.
Thank you, Shelley. We are very close to time. There's an interesting question that came in on the impact of climate change on quality of life metrics for Black communities. I don't think we have time to answer that question, but I would refer that person to some research we published on the impacts of climate change on Black populations in the United States. It's on our website, mckinsey.com. So Shelley and JP, thanks so much for joining us today to share this research with us. It's been a really important discussion. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
And as always, many thanks to all of you in our audience. Today, you will be able to find a replay of the session and previous McKinsey Lives at mckinsey.com. Join us for our next McKinsey Live on October 29th at 10:30 a.m. Eastern as we gear up for COP29 in Azerbaijan and talk about what it will take to meet climate goals and achieve net zero. You can use the magical QR code on your screen to register. See you then. Have a great day or evening and be well.